Well, good evening, folks. Always good to be back in British Columbia. I love Canada, and I especially love British Columbia. And I've been here a number of times now, so I'm almost home. And the reason why I like BC and Canada so much is because I lived in England for 3 years. And you'll never guess the county in England where I lived. Surrey, very good. A for the evening. Somebody knew that already. Oh, is that right? Yeah, it was. Yeah, so I lived in Surrey and went to Box Hill School. And I was there when I was 11 to 13. So by my third year there at the school, I had a thick English accent. And people thought I was a native of England, if you can imagine that. But that was kind of fun. And then we came back to the States, and I lived with my grandparents, and I went to a military academy in Wisconsin. And I went there to the military academy in Wisconsin. I lost my English accent in about a week and a half. And it was back to the old, tired American accent. But it is good to be here. I would ask that if you ever come to North Texas, that you would avail yourself to check out our Discovery Center. We have a Discovery Center there. I don't call it a museum because that kind of gives the implication of a musty, dry, boring type of thing, but our Discovery Center really is quite dynamic, and it is kid-friendly and it's Christ-honoring, those two things. And so you will really enjoy checking out our DC, Discovery Center. If for nothing else, we have a life-size animatronic T-Rex. And so it's a lot of fun. People love that. And we love dinosaurs at ICR. As a matter of fact, we call them missionary lizards. And they're a good evangelistic kind of a thing to have. And so well, we've got just everything that'll keep kids busy, and you could easily spend a day there. And as I like to say, if you come to visit us at the Discovery Center, then what you do is you talk to the people at the front desk and tell them that you're there and to call Dr. Sherwin. I'll come out and we'll have lunch. Hey, that's great. We'll have lunch. I'll pray, you pay, okay? And so, well, what we're going to look at is human evolution. Do you notice that I have quotation marks there? Human evolution, because it really is a, what they call that, an oxymoron. It's like saying airline food, jumbo shrimp, Microsoft Works. Well, anyway, we can have a little fun tonight, but really, human evolution is an oxymoron. People did not evolve. People were created in God's image just thousands of years ago, as we read about in Genesis chapter 2. So let's go ahead and take a look in just the brief time that we have. First of all, we would maintain, as Scripture says, that man was created, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils, what, class? The breath of life, and man became a living soul. This is very unlike what we see about in various kinds of museums throughout the world about so-called man evolving from ape-like ancestors. As we say in Texas, I'm again it. I'm again it, okay? I think this is really the better explanation for our origin. Man was created uniquely, though animals also possess the breath, that is the Hebrew word neshama, and the soul, the Hebrew word nephesh. Man's breath, that's the same word as spirit, and soul were imparted to him by God, look at this, directly. By God directly, rather than indirectly, as imparted to the animals. And by the way, we have been created in God's image, have we not? Right? Luke says in Acts chapter 17, and hath made of one blood all nations of men. Okay? So this idea of races, human races, and so forth, folks, there's only one race, and what is that? The human race. Right? Well, there's two races. There's a human race and the rat race, okay? And the rats are winning. But anyway, yeah, there's just one race, and it's a human race. We've been created in God's image, Acts chapter 17. So let's set the stage for human evolution. I don't want to just do a standing broad jump and expose these myths of missing links and all that. I want to set the stage by talking about the origin of animals, since evolutionists consider us to just be highly evolved animals, and mammals in particular. So one of the biggest questions in evolution is when and how major groups of animals first evolved. That comes from that little Bible college back east called Harvard. Harvard University, August of 2021. So that was only just about 3 years ago that this individual of Harvard University said that. They really don't know when and how major groups of animals first evolved. When and how, that's almost a whole ball of wax, isn't it? And so that's interesting, but it gets better. Understanding how and when animals evolved has proved very what? Difficult for those who study fossils, that is, the paleontologists. And that was a Yale graduate student, again, another Ivy League representative, who said that in 2017. Understanding how and when animals evolved is a real challenge for those who study fossils. While the origin, there's that word, that's a very critical word here this evening, while the origin of mammals has proved one set of puzzles, the diversification of mammals is also ripe with questions. And that was in this book that I have in my library at ICR, Great Transformations in Vertebrate Evolution. So this is a very interesting book, and I really enjoyed reading it because one of the most major transformations, if I can just kind of go off to a rabbit trail very quickly, one of the major transformations is taking a rodent. You know what a rodent is? A rabbit, and yeah, rabbits are rodents. They kind of go in and out in the classification system, but tonight we'll call rabbits rodents, and mice and rats, plus a plethora of other kinds of rodents. It is maintained by evolutionists, got the right kinds of mutations that turned their front legs into wings. What creature am I describing when you have the front legs turn into wings and fly around? It's a mammal. Bat, very good, very good. We got some biologists here, bats. So bats are flying mammals, and they are fantastic. They're wonderful creatures, and I've written several articles about bats. But would that not be a great transformation in vertebrate evolution? Shake your head like this, yeah. Something like a rodent turning into a bat. Folks, that is a great transformation in vertebrate evolution. I looked from stem to stern, from top to bottom, front to back on this book, and didn't find any reference at all to the Chiroptera. In zoology, we call the bats the Chiroptera. Not a word. I think the reason is because there is absolutely no evidence, none, zero, of rodents evolving into bats. The first time we find bats in the fossil record, guess what they are? Bats. Very profound thing to say this evening, but bats have always been bats, you bet. Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. People have always been people, you bet. And so bats have always been bats. And I have a whole bunch of quotes from evolutionists where they are intellectually honest and admit they don't know where the bats come from. They just show up. And there's a sediment, a type of sediment, the sedimentary rock units, that contain not one, but 1,000, approximately 1,000 fossil bats. And you know what they are? They're all bats. Nowhere do we find a fossil of something halfway between a rodent and a bat, something with front legs that are slowly becoming a wing. You just find 100% bats in the fossil record. And we found about, as I say, about 1,000 of them. Moving right along, the origin of the placentalia, the crown group, including modern placental mammals, placental mammals, people have mammalian characteristics and traits. And so, yeah, we are, when it comes to a description, placental mammals, the females. And their ancestors is a what? A much discussed question. Well, that's just a fancy way, a diplomatic way of saying knock down, drag out, fight. They just don't know where the placental mammals came from. And ergo, as of 2015, just a few years ago, is a much discussed question. So I'm not criticizing the evolutionist, and we don't do that at ICR. As a matter of fact, I go out of my way to say, thank the evolutionist for being, as I say, intellectually honest and making statements like this. this. It kind of makes our job easier, doesn't it? If they're not going to listen to the creationist, listen to what your fellow evolutionists are saying. And so that's what Benton had to say, and I use Benton quite a bit, his fourth edition. So, is human evolution a fact? Human evolution is taught as a fact in taxpayer-paid public schools in the States, but evolutionists don't know where, they don't know what, when, or how people evolved from some ape-like ancestor. They just don't know. It gets a little bit. I get a little bit mad because they're using my tax dollars to teach the next generation that they came from lower forms of life, like a fish. And what do we say in Texas? I'm again it. I'm again it. And so this is a quote from Barras, who is with New Scientist magazine. New Scientist magazine is an overtly atheistic publication out of England. It's a science publication, and they said back in August of 2017, look at this quote. Over the past 15 years, almost every part of our story, let's wait right there. What story are they talking about? That human evolution. They're talking about human evolution. Our story, every assumption about who our ancestors were and where we came from has been called into question. Has been called into question. That was in 2015. And I tell you what, the picture hasn't changed at all since the statement was made. As a matter of fact, this statement could have been made this morning, and it is still absolutely true. Where we came from has been called into question. This is late Richard Lewontin, who was a Marxist, Leninist, atheist, evolutionist. And he had absolutely no tolerance for creation science. He was a brilliant scientist. And he said, despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some of those who study fossils, paleontologists, look at this, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. I had Dr. Sherwin look at that date. That's 1982. Yeah, that's right. It's 1982. Why did I include that quote here this evening? Because it's just as true this evening as it was back in 1982 when he said that. We just don't have any fossil hominid species that can be established as our direct ancestor. Well, this is a diagram from the prestigious National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And this is what an evolutionist by the name of Rutherford said in July 3rd of 2021, just 3 short years ago. He said, and I quote, "We've come to realize that we don't actually know the direct pathway from early humans to us." He said, "We've got dotted lines and working theories, but for the most part, we're no longer sure who our ancestors were." Well, folks, that's incredible. They don't know who our ancestors were, and this was said in 2021. This is just very, very recently. Now, something I do want to point out is the solid lines. You see the solid lines there? Those solid lines represent direct fossil evidence, and that's why they make the lines solid. As you see coming up from an unknown, see that word national there? Well, that's underneath that is the hypothetical ancestor that nobody's ever seen. And it comes up, and you see all these solid lines that date the gorillas, that connect the gorillas and the people and chimpanzees and old world monkeys and all that. And so what we would say in creation science is, you shouldn't have solid lines here. What should you have? Dotted lines. Dotted lines that indicate this is hypothetical, this is theoretical. So this is wrong when they put solid lines there. They should be dotted lines. And what we would say as creationists, that we can eliminate all the lines altogether, either dotted or solid lines, and simply look and say, yeah, we can go to a zoo, and any zoo that you want, and we see lemurs, and we see old world monkeys, and chimpanzees, gibbons, and gorillas. Yeah, we see all them. We can see them, right? But the story for the evolutionist is that they're all interrelated to an unknown hypothetical ancestor that conveniently existed millions of years ago. How convenient. Do they know who this ancestor is? And the answer is no, they don't. But the theory of evolution says you have this one ancestor that somehow gave rise to all the creatures you see there. So it's not like we're in overt denial, far from it. We're just saying, let's go where the evidence leads, and that is all these creatures exist at the same time. And that's the only really good conclusion that you can come to. If you want to start saying one is related to another, then we're going to have to see some compelling evidence, and it's not seen so far. Well, Ashworth said 2 years ago of the Natural History Museum, and I quote, "The exact path of human evolution is still the subject of" what? Heated debate, not just debate, folks, but heated debate, knock-down, drag-out arguments with many competing theories over how our species came into being and how many close relatives we have. So that's kind of the status as of 2 short years ago. The time at which the hominid line diverged from that of African apes, such as the chimps and the gorillas, is what? It's controversial. It's controversial, and I have to include Alibi's Dictionary of Zoology here because Alibi is absolutely dead set against creation science. He hates creationists, and he's the editor of this prestigious Dictionary of Zoology that I use every day at work when I write articles for ICR. Well, Dr. Sherwin, what about Lucy? We hear a lot about Lucy, right? You heard about Lucy, the so-called ape-like creature that is our ancestor of over 2 million years ago. And what about Neanderthals? Back when I was a Cub Scout in the Chicagoland area back in I was taken to the museum, and we were told about Neanderthals and that they were our evolutionary ancestors. And so when I was a kid, that was a big deal, the Neanderthals. Well, let's take a look. First of all, the name of Lucy is just a short name for Australopithecus afarensis. Kind of late in the afternoon to be talking like that, but that's Australopithecus. Australopithecus means southern ape. Southern ape. And you know what? We would suggest that's exactly what Lucy was. Lucy was an extinct southern ape. Several hundred pieces of fossilized bone were discovered in East Africa by paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and graduate student Tom Gray in 1974. Lucy is dated by evolutionists to be about 3.75 to 3 million years ago. And somehow, during that intervening time, she began to sire more and more kinds of creatures, not her individually, but her line into what we have today as humans. The problem is the missing links are missing. The missing links are missing. And so Australopithecus, we would suggest, is only an extinct ape. Lucy is the world's most famous extinct ape. She had curved fingers. She had locking wrists. What about locking wrists? Well, those creatures that walk on their hands like gorillas, they have to have their wrist locked so they can have that stability as they walk on their hands. You've seen gorillas walk on their hands, right? And so they need locking wrists. And so the Lord Jesus, when he created those kinds of creatures like the gorillas, created them with locking wrists. Here's a question. Do people have locking wrists? No, because nobody walks on their hands, okay? I do before my second cup of coffee in the morning, but anyway, no, but we don't have locking wrists. We don't need locking wrists because we have been created in the beginning to walk on 2 feet. Very good. This is a budding creationist right there. You bet, walking on our feet. And it had an ape-like skull, a skull that contained a brain that was very ape-like, the same amount of cubic centimeters of the brain. As a matter of fact, Lucy was not becoming human. It was becoming extinct. And we don't have Lucy today. But Dr. Sherwin, what's the big deal about Lucy then? Why, if it's so ape-like, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is they maintain, due to the structure of the pelvis, that Lucy may have walked upright. Well, okay. But when was she walking upright, allegedly? Over 3 million years ago. Nobody saw Lucy walk upright. She's been extinct for 3 million years. But here's another problem. If you want to see an ape-like creature that walks upright, just go to any one of the big museums in the world, not museums, but zoos in the world, and you can see the living pygmy chimpanzee, on occasion, about 10% of the time, walk upright. So we have chimpanzees today that occasionally walk upright. You can tell that they don't like to do that, but they can. And okay, I'll give it to them. We think maybe Lucy may have walked upright. They don't know how often and all that. But if we have living apes today that occasionally walk upright, that's not a very compelling argument. But for the theory of evolution, that's all they have. Lucy's fossil remains match up remarkably with the bones of a pygmy chimp. And I just mentioned the pygmy chimp as she walks about 10% of the time upright. No one can be absolutely sure fragments are even from the same individual when they found Lucy in 1974. The pieces fit where the biased researcher, oh, look at that, biased researcher? Is that true? Yeah. Who here is not biased? Please don't raise your hand. Good. Is this a biased presentation? Absolutely. Okay. So as somebody has said a long time ago, we all come to the party with our biases, right? The only question is, which bias is the best bias to be biased with? Okay. So this is a biased presentation. All the researchers that do evolutionary investigation and research, they are biased as well. So the pieces fit where the biased researcher would like them to go. Whatever fragments are missing must be filled in with plaster of Paris and imagination. Okay, now, Dr. Sherwin, you're just kind of preaching now, giving names like imagination. Scientists don't do that. Scientists don't use imagination. Scientists work with what we can observe and test and repeat. Is that true? Well, this comes from, and if you visit the ICR Discovery Center, you might want to try looking at the Perot Museum. I don't suggest it because it's so expensive getting in there, and it is 100% evolution. But in one of the displays, they have this individual right here, evolutionary paleontologist Peter Dodson. He is not a creationist. And he said in his interview, he said, I have to tell you that imagination is a very, and use the word twice, very, very important trait for those who study fossils. Did you get that? Peter Dodson, he's an authority on certain species of dinosaurs. And he said imagination is a very, very important trait for paleontologists. What does Webster's New World Dictionary say? Imagination is the act or power of forming mental images of what's not present. And so I thought that was interesting. And so I like to quote from Peter Dodson there. He's there at the Perot Museum. Well, what about Neanderthals? And again, when I was in the 6th grade in Chicago, this was such a big deal. Well, some sedimentary deposits have remains of both modern humans and supposed human ancestors, quote unquote. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and that's what we are this evening, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal peoples, and Homo erectus all lived as contemporaries in the past. These people showed ethnic differences in their anatomy, and that's certainly true. Is there room for ethnic differences in anatomy in the human population? Shake your head like this. Absolutely. We find that some people groups here in the world have heavy brow ridge, sloping forehead, and a very, very robust stature, and we call them Eskimos. Eskimos, okay? So they have some very, very unique ethnic differences just because of that particular people group. And by the way, with a heavy brow ridge and looking kind of, well, I won't get into that, but there is a member of the Russian parliament who looks, he looks like a Neanderthal. And I keep forgetting his name, but it's, if you go to where else, the ultimate source of all information, Google search, and type in, you'll be able to see this guy. It's kind of, what's the scientific word? Spooky. But anyway, he's 100% human being is what I'm saying, folks. 100%. He just has a very heavy brow ridge. So they showed ethnic differences in their anatomy, and like us, they were human. This is Homo erectus on the cover of an anti-creation book by a husband and wife team by the name of Alters. And it was published in 2001, and what do they have in the cover but Homo erectus? And so Prehistoric said 18 years after this book was published, and by the way, you see the title of that book? I thought evolution was a fact. I thought everybody understood that evolution was a fact. Why does it need to be defended? But anyway, this book is, it takes Henry Morris and John Morris and ICR and kind of, rubs their face in the dirt and all that. So it's an interesting book, and I have it in my bookshelf at ICR. But 18 years after this book was published, Phys.org said, our mysterious ancestor, Homo erectus. Well, maybe mysterious, but it's still human. If you bumped into Homo erectus in the street, you might not recognize them as being very different from you. Well, that's a good thing to say when it comes to looking at Homo erectus. In other words, put him in a business suit and have him walk down the street, nobody would notice. If for all intents and purposes, what we can see of the shattered remains of the fossils, they were human. Many paleontologists and a majority of creationists think their unusual features of Homo erectus are nothing more than variants of human traits and not transitional at all. Well, here's an urban legend. Who here has heard that people in chimpanzees have 98.4% the same DNA? Have you heard that before? 1, 2, 3, okay. A number of us. Folks, I have to emphasize that this is what we call fake news. This is an urban legend. It is absolutely not true. It is not true that people in chimpanzees have the same 98.4% the same DNA, because genomes, and a genome is your entire genetic complement. Genomes are not recipes, and that's the idea that a lot of people have. Well, you take the genome of something and you make the individual, it's all tied up and it's all done. But a creature that shares 98.4% of DNA with humans is not 98.4% human any more than a fish that shares, say, 40% is 40% human. Do you know that there's fish out there that have 40% of their DNA that's just like people? It doesn't mean you came from a fish. It means that they have a common designer. Well, Dr. Sherwin, why does it have 40% the same DNA? Well, let's think about that. What do fish eat? They eat fats, proteins, carbohydrates, in other words, other fish, right? With fats and proteins and carbohydrates, in order to break that down and extract the energy from it, you need something called enzymes. Enzymes are biological catalysts. They make a reaction go very, very quickly. If you didn't have enzymes, it would take about a century for you to digest your food. And I hate it when that happens, okay? And so the Creator has given us these enzymes that breaks food down lickety-split very, very quickly. And so whether people eat fats, proteins, or carbohydrates, or fish, they all have the same enzymes to do the same job. It's not a common ancestor, it's a common designer. One other thing, what about chimpanzees? Allegedly, our closest evolutionary ancestor. Well, they have a lot of their DNA that's the same. It's about 80%. Whoa, wait a minute. 80% of a chimpanzee DNA is the same of a person? Yep. But think about that. Chimpanzees breathe the same air we breathe, right? Well, I used to teach anatomy and physiology to pre-med students and the nursing students at Pensacola Christian College, and we spent a significant chunk of that time discussing something we call respiratory physiology. So we take it for granted, taking a breath in, and then that breath goes down into the bronchi and the alveoli of our lungs, and there's an extraction of oxygen, and as the blood goes through there and gives up carbon dioxide, gives out oxygen in ways that we're just beginning to understand. It's a fascinating process, but that requires specific respiratory types of enzymes. in order to do that. And so, chimpanzees have the same respiratory physiology, which means all the same enzymes that we have. How about with that digestion I just mentioned, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates? Yeah, they have to have all the same enzymes that we have. And then finally, do chimpanzees drink the same water we drink? Yeah. So if they drink the same water, breathe the same air, eat the same food, would it not be surprising that a lot of their DNA would be the same? Of course. But 80% is not 100%. In other words, there's a good 20% of our genome has nothing to do with the chimpanzee. 20% of our genome has nothing to do with the chimpanzee. It's totally unique. Excuse me, so I thought that's kind of interesting. This individual is no creationist. His name is Tom Prius. He said this in 2012. It is now clear that the genetic differences between people and chimpanzees are far more extensive than previously thought. He's not a creationist. Then he said, their genomes are not 98% or 99% identical. Very, very interesting from Emory University and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a very prestigious secular publication. It is now clear the genetic differences between people and chimpanzees are far more extensive, as Todd has said. And then also this individual, Richard Buggs, he's a PhD out of England. He's out of Queen Mary University out of England. And he said, and I quote, the percentage of the nucleotides, that is the functional unit of a DNA molecule, a nucleotide has a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogenous base. And that makes one of the functional units, and then that's what our DNA molecule is made of. He says the percentage of the nucleotides in the human genome that had a one-to-one exact matches in the chimpanzee genome was, he says, about 84%. But that's nothing like the 98.4% that we've been hit over the head with for who knows how many years. So the myth of 98.5 or 0.4 common DNA. For about 23% of our genome, we share no immediate genetic ancestry with our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. So this individual is obviously an evolutionist, but they're being intellectually honest, and I salute them. Yeah, it's a little bit of an old quote, 2007, but nothing's changed. They've fine-tuned the genetic differences and all. And this comes from an abstract of a paper by Elseberger in Molecular Biology and Evolution. Okay, so that is a very, very interesting quote. So why and where did the so-called pre-humans learn to walk upright? Okay, that's always been a question. When did we stop walking on our hands and start standing upright and walking on 2 feet? Oh, he can walk upright, he just hasn't had his coffee yet. The first recorded upright walking, ta-da! I thought these were funny. The origin of bipedalism, bi means what? 2. The origin of bipedalism, that is, on 2 feet, the key event in the evolution of hominids remains a mystery. Peter Raven said this, and Peter Raven is quite the articulate evolutionist. And he said this back in 2014, but it's certainly apropos for today. And then Trevor Palmer said in 1999, the key advantages gained by early hominids in becoming bipedal are still unclear. And Trevor Palmer, I've read his book several times. He is no friend of the creationist. He again denigrates Henry Morris and ICR. Exactly why and when our ancestors stood upright and started moving around on 2 feet is still shrouded in what? Mystery. It's still a mystery. People have always been people, and people have always been walking on 2 legs, and that's the long and short of it. That's the end of the story. People have always been people. We walk on 2 legs, and if you try and make a connection between animals that don't walk on 2 legs and people that do, you come up empty-handed, because people have always been people. This comes from the BBC, again, no friend of the creationist. So I do want to include this. There's so many, every slide that we're seeing this evening, folks, there's about 10 slides that I also want to show you, but we don't have time. But I had to show you this one because it's what I call ABC. anything but creation, anything but Christianity. And so this is an individual's attempt to explain why people are walking upright. Exploding stars. Exploding stars. That's why people are walking upright tonight. Exploding stars may, I like that word, may trigger ecological changes on Earth, which might, I like that word, might in turn have led people to embrace the two-legged life. May and might. Exploding stars, are you serious? Now, I'm not making fun, but I'm just saying this is the extent that the secular community will go to try and explain that people are nothing unique, that people are just highly evolved animals that learn to walk upright. This, again, is from the same article. The researcher was from the University of Kansas in 2019, and they went on to say in the same article, and I quote, initiating an avalanche of electrons in the lower atmosphere and setting off a chain of events that, there's the word, feasibly ended with bipedal hominins. And so I read that and I'm going, okay, all right, he can go ahead and say that if he wants to. That's fine. I'm not going to make fun of it, but I'm just saying ABC. ABC, anything but creation, even exploding stars and a shower of electrons. Okay, go ahead. What about our tonsils and appendix? You know, when I was growing up in the Chicagoland area, all my little friends got their tonsils taken out because it was taught in medical school in that day, up until the 60s and 70s, I think, that our tonsils were some evolutionary vestige, a leftover, something we don't need anymore. And so they would, any kind of infection, whatever, of the throat, the physician would go in there and take out the tonsils. And unfortunately, they found out, that's not a very good idea, because I learned when I was taking a graduate level course in histology, histology is a study of tissues, that tonsils and the appendix are made up of something called lymphatic tissue. Have you ever heard of lymphatic tissue, lymphocytes? Well, lymphatic tissue programs white blood cells that are called lymphocytes. So without going into too much detail, you have these uninitiated lymphocytes that go through the lymphatic tissue of the tonsils or the appendix and get programmed, as it were. And then they're able to do their job. So when you take out the tonsils, you're taking out one of the first lines of defense. When somebody sneezes in your face, and you're inhaling at the same time, hey, it's those tonsils that kind of do the work that needs to be done. It's, sometimes we still get sick, I understand that. But that's the tonsils and the appendix. What about the fish stage during our embryonic development? When you look at the embryo as it's developing, and it looks like it's going through kind of something like a fish stage, and at one point they talk about our embryo, our embryonic development. We have, for example, the yolk sac, and the gill slits, and the tail. Well, let's take those very, very quickly. I won't spend too much time on that, but do we have a yolk sac? No, it's called a blood sac. When I was in graduate school, I had 5 major professors, and I gave a presentation to them. And at one point, I was having to talk about the quote-unquote yolk sac. But by that time, I understood that there's no yolk in your yolk sac when all of us were developing in utero. What was in the yolk sac, quote unquote? Blood. Something more specifically in biology, we call it blood islands. And those blood islands are needed to produce the first bones of the developing embryo. There's no yolk. Yolk is a no-show. Well, why do they call it a yolk sac, Dr. Sherwin? It's because something like birds and turtles, yeah, they do have yolk in the yolk sac, because they're birds and turtles, okay? But we don't have yolk in the yolk sac. And so really, and by the way, if you were to clip out the yolk sac, that would destroy the developing embryo. And so we have blood islands within the blood sac. And when I was in my graduate presentation, I used the phrase blood sac several times. My professors never challenged me. I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, what about the tail? Do we have a tail as in our embryonic development? Well, it's called the base of the spine, and we have 4 fused bones as we get older, in our late teens, early 20s, that are called the coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X. How important is the coccyx? Well, in wintertime, go out here and fall on your tailbone, and you'll realize how important the coccyx is. You can't lay down, you can't roll over, you can't sit, you can't do anything except moan and groan until it finally heals. What's a purpose, Dr. Sherwin, of the coccyx, these four fused bones? Well, one of the things that we've learned about with the skeleton is it's a site of attachment for what? Anybody? The skeleton, the site of attachment for? Muscles. Yeah, muscles. And so we have, our 206 odd bones, and we need the site of attachment on the skeleton there. I don't want to get too graphic tonight, but I do have to say this, that some of the muscles that attach to the coccyx help with what we call the defecation reflex. And it's pretty important that you have that, okay? And so what we like to do at ICR is diplomatically, lovingly challenge the secular evolutionary community. I say this every single time. We at ICR will pay for a volunteer who's an evolutionist to have their coccyx removed. If it is a useless evolutionary relic, a non-functional bit of tissue in the human body, then they should not hesitate to have their coccyx removed. And once again, I'm telling you right now, we will go ahead and we'll pay all the hospital bills and everything else. But there's one thing we won't pay for, and that is the diapers that individual is going to need for the rest of his life. Because without the coccyx, you don't have those muscles, and I won't go into detail, but you're going to need diapers for the rest of your life. We won't pay for that. Okay, and so that's our tailbone, our so-called tail. But Dr. Sherwin, you didn't say anything about babies born with a tail. Okay, I better mention that now. Sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes a child will be born with an adipose structure coming out of the base of the spine. During embryonic development, I learned this in embryology when I was in graduate school, but you have the neural ridges. They're called neural ridges during our neural development, and they come together and fuse. And 99.9% of the time, it's nice and smooth as these neural ridges cover your spinal column. Sometimes, however, due to a mutation, those neural ridges will overlap. And at certain points, they'll overlap and they'll form a fatty tumor. And so then the child is born with a quote-unquote tail. And so it has nothing to do with the tail. More often than not, you don't find any bone or muscle or nerve or anything like that. The physician will just add a little bit of lidocaine, which is a painkiller, and remove that. And sometimes physicians will tell the distraught parents, well, you did give birth to a throwback to the fish stage. And they shouldn't say that because that's not true at all, okay? And so those are the three things I like to talk about, the so-called tail and the yolk sac and that's it, gill slits, okay? That's another one, gill slits. And sure enough, during embryonic development, you have structures in the neck that look like gill slits. But folks, they only look like gill slits. But remember, gills for fish are specifically designed by the Creator to extract oxygen from the water, okay? So are they true gill slits? They're not at all. They're not gill slits. They may look like gill slits. Well, let's see now. When we were our first baby picture is about the size of a period on a sentence, at the end of a sentence. That's what we all look like right after the sperm fertilized the egg. We were just a round ball that was fertilized. A round ball. Well, let's see, BBs and ball bearings and marbles, they're small round things. Maybe we came from them. Well, no, that's silly, okay? But it's the DNA that's inside that fertilized egg that we call the secondary oocyte. And so really, you can't tell the difference between a person and an elephant at that stage of that fertilized secondary oocyte. But then during the developmental process, then of course things began to change due to the construct of the DNA message in there. And so, yeah, what about that? Well, it looks like, It looks like gill slits, but it has nothing to do with extracting oxygen from the water. As a matter of fact, those so-called gill slits during development help to turn into things like the inner ear and the thymus and the parathyroid glands. You can't live without your thymus and parathyroid glands. You can live without your inner ear, but it'd be pretty painful. And so, yeah, thymus gland, parathyroids, it help with calcium balance and all that. That's all very, very important, but it has nothing to do with so-called gill slits. They only say gill slits because they look like gills. And then they use a fancy phrase. They say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Oh, my head hurts when I talk about that. But anyway, so that's a situation. So what I'm saying this evening, folks, is that creation scientists, the creationists in general, have very logical explanations for some of these so-called evidences for evolution. Choi said in Life Science back in 2009, if Darwin had been aware of the species that have an appendix attached to a large cecum, and if he had known about the widespread nature of the appendix, he probably would not have thought of the appendix as a vestige of evolution. And folks, that's what we say at ICR. Your appendix is very, very important. Dr. Sherwin, I have had my appendix out for 40 years and I'm doing just fine. That's great. That's great. But what we're saying is you do better if you had it, right? Because your appendix is also made up of something called lymphatic tissue, which helps with the programming of lymphocytes. Your appendix is about the size of your little finger. In Texas, we call these a finger. But anyway, and it's only provided, it's just one small artery that gives it oxygenated food and oxygen, that sort of thing. And so sometimes that artery will get blocked, or in medicine they call it occluded. It's a fancy way of saying blocked. And then all that tissue in the appendix starts to rot. And you have what? You had appendicitis, right? And you've got this appendix that really hurts, and you have to have it removed. But yeah, you can live without your appendix. That's not evidence of evolution, just like you can live without your arms, but you do better if you had them, right? and so, yeah, the appendix is pretty important, and it's just simply part of our immune system. What if humans didn't have an appendix? Choi said in 2021, that organ may not be a useless artifact of evolution after all. Well, folks, we've been saying that for decades, that God doesn't make any junk. Do you believe that this evening? Yeah, God doesn't make any junk. And so because we don't know exactly the function of a tissue or a structure doesn't mean it's just automatically junk. It just means that we have to catch up with what the Creator has created. Well, is the evolution of upright walking the cause of our back problems? Sometimes when you go to a chiropractor, they might say, and some of them do and some of them don't, it all depends on the chiropractor, and they'll say, well, the reason why Americans today have such bad back problems is because we only recently, in evolutionary timescale, learned how to walk upright. Well, it sounds compelling because there are so many billions of dollars that are spent every year in American, both the adults and young people, for chiropractic type of work and operations and all that, because supposedly we have just recently learned how to walk upright. But what's really the cause of our back problems? It's got nothing to do with evolution. Lack of exercise, too much sitting. Have you heard the phrase that sitting is the new smoking? Have you heard that before? That's why I use a very desk now. I stand up as I work at ICR. I try not to sit down at all. Obesity, bad habits, slouching and all that. Slouching year after year, that's going to cause problems in your back, and that doesn't have anything to do with evolution. Injury, like car injuries. Yeah, that can cause back problems too, and other reasons that are simply not due to evolution. So here's a very desk. Have you seen these before? This is a very desk. The reason why I like to talk about that is because it was invented in Coppell, Texas, which is just a stone's throw from ICR. And so I use the very desk at work now all the time. Here's a name of an article that was written a couple of years ago, Why Our Bags Are Wrecking Our Backs. NBC News said heavy backpacks or bags can lead to back problems and poor posture. That has nothing to do with evolution. It's those heavy backpacks, especially for young people, using those heavy backpacks, and they're doubled over and all, and it's no wonder that they have the back problems that they have. About 5,000 children visit emergency rooms each year because of what? Backpack-related injuries. Backpack-related injuries, nothing to do with Darwinian evolution. When and how did the so-called pre-humans learn to speak? I park a little bit on this because this is very, very important. This ability to articulate ourselves with our grammar and our syntax as we speak with one another. That is a unique gift that God has given us. Folks, there is no indication whatsoever that human speech has come from the barks and the grunts of some animals ever so many years ago. Now, Wikipedia, I usually don't quote from Wikipedia, but I had to use this one quote. The shortage of direct empirical evidence, empirical means that which we can observe and test and repeat, empirical evidence has caused many scholars to regard the entire topic as unsuitable for serious study. They simply throw up their hands and say, we don't know how people began to learn how to speak. It's a big mystery and unsuitable for serious study. Well, humans possibly, according to one evolutionary publication, they use the word possibly, emerged with fully modern linguistic capacity 500,000 years ago. What is that, 500,000 years ago? But evolutionist Noam Chomsky, and he's a Marxist-Leninist atheist, he hates creationists. Noam Chomsky said in 1996, now look at this is Noam Chomsky, a single chance mutation, just a random mutation, just one, occurred in one person 100,000 years ago in a hypothetical portion of the midbrain in near perfect form, installing the language faculty. I thought, that's a stretch. Now, thank you, Dr. Chomsky, for saying that, and I'm not, we're not making fun or anything, but come on. A single chance mutation occurred in one, how do you validate that? How do you verify that? What do? You get in a time machine and go back and find that one person and do the... A single chance mutation occurred in one person 100,000 years ago in and there's the key word, hypothetical portion of the midbrain in near perfect form. Well, that's kind of the status. The capacity for language is built upon our ability to understand combinations of words and the relationships between them, but the evolutionary history of this ability is little understood. Well, folks, it's not little understood, it's simply not understood at all, period. That's it. Nobody understands how we can understand combinations of words and the relationships between them. The evolutionist simply doesn't know, and that was said just 4 short years ago. Language has long been considered a very complex skill, and of course it is, mobilizing specific brain networks. However, and I'm quoting here from 2 evolutionists that, once again, they do not love creationists. And the guy's name is Doug Fujiyama. And he is very, very cynical towards creationists. He said there is no clear picture of when and how human language evolved. They don't know when, and they don't know how. And again, that's the whole ball of wax, isn't it? Don't know when or how human language evolved. We can understand each other now, but how did it evolve? Through time and chance and barks and grunts. It looks like we have always had the capacity to speak. We have always had the capacity to walk upright. People, in other words, have always been people. Thank you, people. We argue instead that the richness of ideas is accompanied by a poverty of evidence. Yeah, you can have all the ideas you want, but the evidence is not there, with essentially no explanation of how and why our linguistic computations and representations evolved. So they simply don't know. And over again, I'm using a number of quotes here from evolutionists to make my point. Language is unique and has shown up, as it will, fully formed. So what's the key tool used in human evolution studies? Well, I mentioned that earlier, but it is imagination. It's imagination. This is a cartoon written by a Chicago cartoonist a long time ago, about 35 years ago, but I'll go ahead and share it with you tonight. Sometimes people get mad when I show this cartoon. They say, Frank, you're making fun of evolutionists, and that's not my point this evening. I do want to emphasize that. But this is the cartoon. This is young Charles Darwin, and the nurse is saying to young Charles Darwin by candlelight, "The princess kissed the frog, and it changed into a handsome prince." And young Charles Darwin is saying, "Boy, when I grow up, I'm going to write stuff like that." So, okay, yeah, this is what was said, and this is why sometimes people get upset. And I usually don't do that, but there's a reason why I did that this evening. Let me show you why. Because there's a quote in Zoologist magazine that is quoting Charles Darwin saying, "One's imagination must fill up the very wide blanks." Okay, there you go. Charles Darwin himself said one's imagination must fill up the very wide blanks. That's why this is not so much of a putting the knife in and twisting it, because that's exactly what Darwin said when he got older. Just use your imagination to fill up those wide blanks. So why do evolutionists use imagination? Well, paleontologist Philip Curie of the University of Alberta said, paleontology in general is a gigantic puzzle where most of the pieces are missing. Most of the pieces are missing. So in conclusion tonight, we would look at what we read in Genesis chapter 1. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, and male and female created he them. Verse 27 of Genesis 1. Versus what Daniel Lieberman is quite the evolutionist when it comes to human evolution. He said the origins of the genus Homo remain as murky as ever. Remain as murky as ever. They simply don't know the origin of Homo sapiens, 100% people. So this evening you have to make a choice. Do you believe you've been created in God's image, Genesis chapter 2, or here, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27? Or do you believe that we came up from the apes over millions of years? But the scientific evidence there is found wanting. It's quite lacking.